So on June 19th, 2017, I uploaded a video titled Top 5 Neutral and Everyday Eyeshadow Palettes. And it is hysterical going through what some of my favorites were, looking at it now. The Kat Von D Shade and Light Eye Palette, the Tarte Tartlet in Bloom, Too Faced Chocolate Bar Palette, LEAH Pro 3 Palette. I have none of those eyeshadow palettes anymore. None. Not one. So I'm certain that amidst many of favorites videos and holy grail roundups, etc., all of those types of videos that I've mentioned some of my favorite palettes. However, I thought that 3 years has gone by and those favorites are definitely very old, and thought it would be fun to update you on my top neutral everyday eyeshadow palettes. Now you guys know I'm not a big wearer in the eyeshadow realm. However, when I do wear eyeshadow, I typically go for a very similar staple go-to look that requires a very similar palette of shades. So if you're like me and you don't like to divulge too much in your daily eyeshadow, these palettes are going to be the picks that are perfect for you. Now, when I was considering the palettes for this video and what I consider my perfect ideal neutral palette to be, I am looking for an inner corner highlight, a couple of mid-tone transition-y creasy shade brown shades, a deeper brown shade and or a black, and that's pretty much it. Those are the shadows that I like to use for my very simple go-to everyday look. Gotta get a little faux liner in there with a deeper shade. So those are kind of the guidelines for me. Everything else is a bonus. So with that being said, when I was going through all of the palettes that I now have in my collection, I actually don't have a perfect palette. A perfect neutral palette does not exist for me. I'm definitely a mixologist. I like to mix and match and dip into different palettes when I'm playing with eyeshadow. Most of the time I just wear my bronzer and highlighter, but it was very interesting to go through and see the shades that I would switch up and change in some of my favorite neutral palettes, and then some of the palettes that are smaller and have less shadows. I usually dip into 2 or 3 of them to complete my ideal look. So I found that really interesting, that looking at all of the palettes that I have and all of the palettes that I've had in the past, I'm still waiting for my perfect palette, my perfect neutral palette to come into existence. Maybe this is something I need to create. Who knows what the future holds? I'm not hinting at anything, I swear to God. I have no upcoming plans, but if any brands want to allow me to assist in creating the perfect everyday neutral palette for lazy eyeshadow gals like me, hit me up. So let's get into the top 5 eyeshadow palettes. I say that loosely because there's a few shades, and then I have a few bonuses that I wanted to talk about after. So number 1, the Anastasia Beverly Hills Soft Glam palette. This might come as a surprise to you because it's been a hot minute since I have used this palette, but it is one palette that just has survived many a declutter in my life, and in terms of like warm tones, this has really everything that I need when it comes to eyeshadow. You've got beautiful shimmery lid toppers here, a ton of varying beautiful browns, deeper browns, and a black. Like, this really is the ideal palette. I would just love it if it was smaller, and there's a few shades that I could live without, but in terms of what it has, it's such a good classique, if you will, and if you are a warm tone neutral gal, this one's the one for you. Now, up on the pricier end of the spectrum, the Natasha Nona Biba palette, literally titled the neutral palette. This one is absolutely glorious, and what I like about this is it has a really good mix of warm tones and cool tone shadows in here. You can really do so many looks with this palette. My only beef with it is if I were to have like one makeup bag, when so many of you ask me, what should I buy? I'm buying one neutral palette. What's one palette you would tell me to buy and have in my collection? This is a really big palette for the everyday gal to lug around, you know? Like, it's not small, it ain't dainty, and it doesn't easily fit into any of your makeup bags. So that's my only beef with it. It's not even beef because you're getting a lot of product in here. It's a beautiful palette. But when I think of like an everyday palette, I don't necessarily think of the biggest thing that's out there. You know what I mean? So it's large in size. However, the shadows are very gorgeous, and this would definitely get you through any neutral look that you could possibly dream of in your life. Moving on to the smaller end of the spectrum, the Lawless Beauty, the Little One. This is, I'd say, the newest palette to me. This really reminds me, like, it brings back the memories of the old LEAH Pro To Go palette. I know it's like not really the same at all, but this packaging is the same as that LEAH Pro To Go. Like, the whole look and feel reminds me of it. And I actually don't know why I don't use this palette more. It's perfect. Like, I could totally travel with this and it would have everything I need. I think it's a perfect size as well. Like there's no wasted space here. I think it's great. Other than this white creamy shade here that I know I'd never use, it's like almost there. It's almost the perfect palette for me. But if you haven't tried the little one, she's a beaut. The next palette I wanted to mention are my Marc Jacobs Iconics palettes, and the shade 720 Glambition in particular is what I'm including in this top 5 neutrals palette, because I really think you have a beautiful range of shades here. This would give you that perfect like neutral smoky eye, with the exception coming from Scandalust, which is really funny because whenever I talk about these palettes, I talk about these two in the same breath. But when I look at these shades here, if I were to take the shadows from these two palettes and create my perfect palette, what I would do is remove this very, very white shimmery inner corner highlight. It reminds me of Floof from MAC. And then this pinky hued one, I'd take those out and I would pop this perfect champagne toned inner corner highlight and this warm brown, because out of this palette, those are truly the only two shadows I use. Switch those two shadows out and you have my perfect palette. That's my perfect palette right there. The tones, the shades, everything is delightful and divine. And if I could just swap those two, they'd be perfect. Dan was just like, why don't you depot them? And I'm like, I don't know. Should I try? Would I absolutely destroy these palettes if I tried swapping the shadows out? So really, Glambition is close. Scandalous, like I definitely use the two together, so it's kind of cheating one. But this formula, the packaging, I've just loved these for so long, and I couldn't not include them. For the 5th top neutral eyeshadows, you guys know that I'm such a luxe lover when it comes to makeup in general, but definitely when it comes to the eyeshadow palettes. I find that the drugstore, for the most part, like in Canada, if you're going to Shoppers Drug Mart, if you're going to Walmart, what have you, you're pretty limited in your drugstore eyeshadow palette options. I think you have a lot more options if you're shopping online, obviously, and I feel like the States has a lot more option. But in general, generally speaking, I usually prefer the luxe side of life when it comes to palettes. However, I did want to include a drugstore affordable option for you, and that would definitely be the Wet n Wild palettes, specifically the shade My Glamour Squad. This one's just like my warm, neutral shadow dreams. I did an entire dupe video on this eyeshadow palette and how it compares to the Anastasia Beverly Hills Soft Glam palette. So if you're looking for a drugstore dupe of this otherwise perfect palette, there you have it. They're pretty much the same in tone. But yeah, the Wet n Wild eyeshadows are just my particular favorites from the drugstore. I think they're so creamy and beautiful and, God, just so affordable. Like, you really can't go wrong. If you want like cool tone neutrals or the ability to mix and match both, the Nude Awakening palette is a really beautiful option to give you those more cool toned shades. So these ones from Wet n Wild, they're just stunning and definitely make my top 5 go-to neutral palettes. And that's it. Those are my favorite palettes, the most perfect neutral palettes across the board that I have in my collection. If you guys were looking to purchase any kind of neutral eyeshadow palette, go-to everyday use palette, those would be my top picks. I did want to include some honorable mentions that didn't quite make the cut but felt necessary to talk about, and the most recent being the Victoria Beckham palettes, and I just did an entire brand review on Victoria Beckham if you guys missed that. I will link it down below for your viewing pleasure, but mainly being that I love these, and you could absolutely burn all of these eyeshadow palettes and I would happily spend the rest of my days exclusively using these palettes. But the only problem, and it's not even a problem, like I'll happily dip into many, but it's not a complete palette. Like I can't do a complete look with just this. I can't do a complete, well, I mean, you can, but we're talking about my perfect palette here, okay? So I definitely need to mix and dip into a bunch of these, so it's not just one singular palette that could make the cut, you know? Like, I require many different flavors from the Victoria Beckham palette, so I think if you're buying multiple of these, that could be your perfect neutral little moment. But I definitely couldn't rely on just one of these for my taste, so that's why they didn't quite make the top 5 cut, but I have to talk about them. I blab about them all the time. Of course they're my favorite. The next being the Tom Ford eye color quads, and the same thing with the Victoria Beckham palettes. There's 4 shades in here and they don't quite make a complete eye look for me. And the next problem being that this one, 27 Mink Mirage, like this can create a perfect smoky eye. It's beautiful. But then you have Cocoa Mirage. Like, did this replace Cocoa Mirage? I don't really know. I love the browns in here, but you're not getting a complete look out of just one of them, for me anyway. And they discontinued Cocoa Mirage, so that's why I can't really talk about it happily because it doesn't exist anymore. So that is why the Tom Ford was excluded here. However, they are beautiful, and I love them so. And the final one, the honorable mention I wanted to mention, are the Dior Backstage palettes. And this one kind of makes me sad because this is another palette that I would just love to collaborate on and be like, hello, Dior, can I just make my perfect palette and steal your packaging? I mean, Victoria Beckham is certainly the prettiest, but in terms of functionality, this is my favorite packaging for sure. This is the universal neutrals, this is the warm neutrals, and each of these palettes, they have a little creamy eye primer in there, and then this one has a little mixing putty that you can use to create liners and what have you. And I feel like those could just be removed, and with a little bit of mixing and matching, a blend of these two palettes could also create my perfect palette. But when we're talking about neutrals, these are definitely palettes I go to so much like the other two options. I usually have both of these open at once. I'm not just using one or the other. They kind of go together for me, so it's a 2-in-1 deal. I wish I could just smush them together and create my perfect palette, mix and match. But yeah, that's the final honorable mention there. And you guys, those are my favorite neutral palettes. It's quite a difference from the top 5 palettes that I filmed 3 years ago, which is crazy. I can't believe it's been that long. Time is flying and I'm getting old. But hopefully this gives you good insight into what some of my most used and loved and favorite neutral palettes are in my collection. My everyday faves. That's a lot of palettes for a gal who doesn't wear a lot of eyeshadow. And I would love to hear from you guys. Let me know what you think of my picks. If you think I am just tragically missing a palette in my life, I'd love to hear what your favorites are. What are your go-to neutral palettes for everyday use? Let me know all your thoughts in the comments down below, you guys. We couldn't leave this day without doing an Everyday May giveaway. Here is another one of my favorite product boxes. Can't show these boxes. You guys know what's in here. You've been following along. Here's a box of some of my favorite products. The only thing we're waiting on to add to this box is the Biba palette. We're just waiting on a shipment from Sephora. You know, COVID, the backlog delivery dates, so this box will also include the Biba palette. So you can check the description box down below on how to enter today's box of favorites. My fave goodies piled in a box. Thank you guys so much for all of the love that you've been showing the Everyday May videos so far. Congrats to all the winners so far. Things are getting spicy. Thank you so much for watching this video, you guys, and I'll see you all tomorrow for a new one. Bye!